Welcome to our Israel-Palestine podcast, a project by graduating high school students from Berlin-Neukölln, home to Germany's largest Palestinian diaspora, and a second home to many young Israelis. Israel and Palestine are painfully present in our district and in our schools. We've spoken with historians, legal scholars, trauma researchers, and educators, some of whom are world-leading experts to better understand this ongoing conflict. Our approach has been multi-perspectival. We don't aim to resolve controversies or contradictions, but to hear different perspectives. Human rights and international law are the foundation of responsible multi-perspectivism. Can we learn to listen and hold conflicting truths at the same time? Find your own answers, or better, questions. Are you ready for the discomfort of learning?
Welcome to a new episode of our Israel-Palestine podcast. We have a very special guest today. Professor Omer Bartov is one of the world's leading scholars of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Born in Israel in 1954, he served in the Israeli army during the 1973 Yom Kippur War before pursuing history studies at Tel Aviv University and earning his doctorate from Oxford, working on the war crimes of the Wehrmacht. Now a professor at Brown University in Providence, he has spent decades researching how violence unfolds not only through armies and ideologies, but also between neighbors within communities. His landmark book, Anatomy of a Genocide, explores the town of Buczacz, where his mother was born, a case study of how genocide happened on a local level. It was awarded the National Jewish Book Award and the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research. The German translation of his most recent book, Genocide, the Holocaust and Israel-Palestine, is out since 2 days. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Bartov. We are excited to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Welcome, Professor Bartov. Thank you very much for making the time.
Thank you for having me here.
Professor Bartov, you were born in Israel as a child of Holocaust survivors. What led you to study genocide, and how did your family history shape your path as a historian?
Well, I should say I wasn't born as the child of Holocaust survivors because my mother's father, my grandfather, left Buczacz in 1935. So she and her brothers and her parents came to Palestine before World War II. The rest of the family that stayed there were all murdered. But strictly speaking, I'm not a child of Holocaust survivors. There were many around me who were. What effect that had on me, it's hard to say. I would say that one major aspect for me was more the fact that I was growing up in a society where so many people came from mutilated families, for families where so many people had been lost, either their own parents were survivors or their other members of their families never came. We all had multiple so-called aunts and uncles who weren't really aunts and uncles, but were distant relatives that made up families because the actual families had all been murdered. So that was certainly part of the background in which I was growing up. But the other side of it was almost the exact opposite. And I write about this in this book, that the kind of education that we received growing up in the 1950s and 60s in Israel was very much forward-looking. We were not supposed to really ask too many questions about where our families came from, or what had been in the place that we were born in just before our birth, but rather to look forward. And part of it was a very strong Zionist inclination. The other had also, I'd say, a sort of socialist aspect to it. You have to build a new world on the ruins of the old. So in that sense, my generation was a generation in which there was a great deal of denial of where our families had come from and what had happened to them, and denial of what had happened in Israel before the state was established or right after its establishment to the Palestinian population there.
Your work emphasizes the importance of empathy when studying mass violence. That's why first-person accounts like diaries are very important for your research. Why should historians not stay objectively detached but need to emphasize with personal stories to understand mass violence?
Yeah, look, I mean, historians should be objective, but should not be objectively detached. It's not exactly the same thing, right? A historian who is completely detached from his or her story, the history that they're writing, will not really be able to understand the people, the period, the culture about which they're writing. They need to be objective to the extent that they can truthfully balance between different versions, different narratives of what occurred in that past. The past is never one thing. If you think about your present, you know that present, which will soon become past, is not just one story. Different people see the world they live in very differently. And so that's the same with the past. There are various ways that people had existed in that past. One way is through the personal experience. And historians often would like to rely more on documentation that they can find in archives that is produced by states or administrative or bureaucratic agencies because it's convenient. It sums things up, it has nice dates and stamps on it, but it tells only part of the story. It tells the story from the top or the story through the eyes of a particular state or organization. It does not necessarily tell the story, let's say, as you experience it, right? I mean, you don't experience your reality through the eyes of some bureaucracy. And so it's the same in that sense. And that becomes all the more urgent, I would say, when you engage with telling the history of a war or of a genocide, whereby much of the personal experience, at least of those who are victims of it, is erased by the very same people who are also engaged in killing people. And so to rescue those stories is really to rescue part of the reality that was in the process of being eradicated precisely by those who were producing official documents.
Okay. We now want to ask you some question about genocide in Gaza. Let's start with the basics. What are the historical origins of the Genocide Convention? What does international law define as genocide? And is this the same definition historians use?
Well, good question. So, the historical origins of the definition of genocide or the Genocide Convention go back really, well, it depends where you want to start. You can start in the late 19th century with attempts to legislate rules about warfare. So you have, let's say, the Hague Convention of 1907, and then attempts to bring to justice, mostly failed attempts to bring to justice those who carried out crimes against humanity or genocide, although the word did not exist yet, in World War I, especially the case of the genocide of the Armenians. So I would say that there were several tracks leading toward this, which had to do with trying to protect soldiers, wounded soldiers, prisoners of war, then expanding that to the attempt to protect civilians at times of war, and to set a series of rules and regulations and customs, what is allowed and what is not allowed in war. And that goes back to the late 19th century and early 20th century, because violence became much more, engaged much more attacks on civilian populations, cases of ethnic cleansing, mass refugees, population policies before and during World War I. So this is one aspect of it. The second aspect of it, and that's more directly on the Genocide Convention, there were two legal experts engaged in trying to think through this issue of the connection between war and the killing of large numbers of civilians. One was Herr Schlauterpacht, and the other was Raphael Lemkin. Both of them actually attended not exactly the same time, but the same university, the University of Lviv, Lemberg, in what is now West Ukraine, but at the time was in Poland. Raphael Lemkin, as a young lawyer in the 1930s, became increasingly interested in the case of the Armenian genocide, an event of mass killing, deportations, mass killing of populations, and was trying to find a way of defining that differently from other types of crimes, war crimes, or regular criminal breaches of the law. In 1939, Lemkin escaped from Poland. He was Jewish. Much of his family was murdered, and he ended up in the United States. And in the United States, he wrote a big, important book in which there's one chapter that tries to define genocide. And his definition of genocide which led then to the Genocide Convention in 1948, is interesting and different from any other legislation on international humanitarian law that came to be known after World War II. Because his definition of genocide speaks about the destruction of a group as such, in whole or in part. That is, it's not concerned simply with killing of large numbers of civilians, which would be the case of crimes against humanity, as Herr Schlauterpacht then sort of led the legislation on that. It's not that an army or any organization in time of peace or war intends to kill or doesn't care about killing large numbers of civilians. It's that these civilians or these individuals are being killed as members of a group. The intent is to destroy the group as such. And that in 1948, after he struggled for several years to get the UN interested in adopting that definition, was adopted by the UN. And so if you think about what is now the only definition of genocide that matters under international law, it is the Genocide Convention of 1948, which says that you have to show an intent to destroy a particular group. It could be an ethnic group, could be a national group, could be a racial group, to destroy a group in whole or in part as such. So that means that in legal terms, if you want to identify genocide, you have to show two things. You have to show that there is an intent, that an intent has been expressed by the people who are engaged in that policy. And secondly, that intent is being implemented on the ground. And the intent is to destroy the group. So it's not enough to show that many people are being killed, which nowadays, because genocide is a term that people use more generally for something atrocious, it's not enough to show that many people are being killed. You need to show that they're being killed with the intent of destroying that group to which they belong. Now, there are other people who have, other definitions of genocide, and they're fine. I have nothing against it, but in international law, it doesn't really matter how you or I or anyone else defines genocide. What matters is the definition in the UN Convention.
What does it take to prove a genocide, and how is it even possible before a court ruling?
So it's difficult to prove genocide, and I think that's a limitation, but it's also an advantage because look, I mean, the problem that has been identified with the definition of genocide is that because genocide is now supposed to be the crime of crimes, the worst thing that can be done, then if you can't prove genocide, then that crime can't be that great, which of course is absurd because war crimes are terrible. Crimes against humanity are terrible. And genocide is terrible. And it isn't that one is worse than the other. It's simply that they are different types of crimes. How do you prove genocide? It's difficult often because the organizations or states engaged in that don't want to create a paper trail, don't want to show that that's what they're doing. They try to camouflage it as something else, often as war operations. Often those who are engaged in genocide claim that it's a war or claim that the people who are carrying out the genocide are just soldiers. And so often it's hard to prove intent. However, there are many cases of genocides in the past where intent was expressed. Certainly Nazi Germany expressed intent. In the Ottoman Empire, there were expressions of intent to eradicate the Armenian population. And in fact, in the case that we may be talking about here, in the case of Gaza, unfortunately, Israeli military and political leaders expressed intent to destroy Gaza from the very beginning. Already on October 7th, October 8th, October 9th, there were many statements to that effect that could easily be defined as genocidal statements, which, by the way, themselves can be considered as crimes. That is, incitement to genocide is also a crime. Now, the problem is that you then, if there are such statements, then you have to show that these statements were being implemented. And often it'll be very hard to show that there was a plan to find all the orders that then evidence of implementation of those statements or of that intent. What you can show, however, if you don't get your hands on the archives of those states, and one of the only states with which that happened is Germany, because Germany lost the war and people could easily get into its archives and see exactly what was in there if it wasn't destroyed. What you can show, if you don't have the documents, is a pattern. If you can show a pattern of operations that seems to conform to the statements that were made by politicians and by, in this case, army officers, then that can serve instead of being able to find the particular documents that may have never been written or may have never come into your hands or were destroyed. In the case of what we've seen in Gaza, I would say that the pattern became increasingly clear over time. And I personally could say that I became convinced of that pattern sometime around May of 2024. So although there was evidence before, that pattern became increasingly clear over time.
You have argued that Israel war in Gaza constitutes genocide. This marks a shift in your position. Can you walk us through your process? How has your view evolved? What did you initially think and what changed?
On this particular case, I published an article in the New York Times in early November 2023. And that article argued, first of all, made the distinction between the different types of crimes, of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Said that there appeared to be evidence to show that the IDF was engaged in war crimes and in crimes against humanity, but that there was still not sufficient evidence to show that this was a genocidal operation. However, the article was written in large part to warn that if this pattern that could be seen at the time would continue, That is, if things did not stop, then we may end up speaking about genocide. And I wrote there specifically that it's better to warn against genocide before it happens rather than to lament it having happened already. So that was in November. And I have to say that in November or December, things could have stopped, especially the US, the Biden administration at the time, could have put an end to this. It chose not to do so. In fact, it chose to support Israel's actions in Gaza by an endless flow of arms and by providing it with diplomatic cover. And so by May, I started to think, and that came out in an article that I published in August in The Guardian, that it was no longer possible to deny that what we were seeing was genocide. And the main reason for my own shift was that in May, the IDF, in early May, the IDF decided, despite warnings from the US, decided to move into Rafah, into the southernmost city of Gaza, in which about 1 million civilians were concentrated, most of them people who had been displaced more than once already. And the Americans were warning Israel that that would lead to large numbers of civilian deaths. There had already been I think by then about 20,000 people who died. And the IDF said, no, we'll take care of it. And they moved most of that population, forcibly moved it to the Mawasi area, to the sort of coastal area in southwestern Gaza. And then they moved into Rafah. The place that they were moved to was a place that had no infrastructure, without any sanitation, any sort of infrastructure for survival. That, to me, at that point, I started looking back at the entire pattern of operations by the IDF. And what you could identify was that the IDF was not actually trying to do the two things that it had claimed were its war aims, which was to destroy Hamas and release the hostages. It did not release hostages through fighting. In fact, they were only released through negotiations. And it did not destroy the leadership of Hamas, which in fact is still around, and Israel is still negotiating with it indirectly. What it did do was systematically destroy everything in Gaza. And not only houses, but hospitals, museums, schools, mosques, universities, water plants, everything that makes A, for the survival of a population, just the sheer physical survival, and B, that serves for its cultural identity, educational, religious institutions, and collective identity and collective memory. Now, since then, things, of course, have become much worse since that May. And in October 2024, the IDF began an operation which was known as, although it denied that that was the basis for it, under the name of the General's Plan, which was to empty the top third of Gaza, north of the so-called Netzarim corridor, of its population through telling the population to leave and then starving the population that is that remains behind, simply not allowing any humanitarian assistance whatsoever. And it managed to more or less empty that area of the population and entirely destroyed it. The city of Gaza, the refugee camp of Jabalia, and so forth. That ended because the incoming new president of the United States, Donald Trump, appears to have forced Israel to accept a ceasefire, which is now over, of course. And so the people had fled from northern Gaza, which was supposed to remain empty, returned there. But they returned to a place where they cannot live because there's no houses there. So they are living on top of the ruins of their houses. Once that ceasefire was broken by Israel, which had agreed to it and then broke it, this operation resumed, but not only in northern Gaza. It is happening now north of the Netzarim corridor, but Israel is now, the IDF is carrying out the same operation also in the south, and is making the entire city of Rafah that I mentioned before into one great big pile of debris. It's destroyed already, much of it. And so what you see right now, and I'm speaking about the pattern, right? What you see right now is that the top third of Gaza has been more or less emptied of its population. 20% of Gaza in the south has been emptied of its population. There's a wide road that was now built by Israeli bulldozers, and that's about 16% of the territory. And another 20% of the territory, the so-called buffer zone, which was created, it's about a kilometer-wide zone between Gaza and the Israeli territory, which used to be also part of the most important agricultural land to sustain life in Gaza, has now been completely obliterated as a buffer zone and as a kill zone. That is, anybody who goes there will be shot. That's a pattern of moving the population into a smaller and smaller area with less and less ability to survive, even just sheer physical survival.
Thank you very much. What would have been an appropriate response to the horrific attack of October 7th then?
Look, I think there are two things that you can say about this. First, you need to think where all this was coming from. If you only start on October 7th and you don't understand anything of what happens there, you need to understand the motivations of the actors involved, right? How did they get to that point? So if you talk about that context, you have to remember that Gaza had been under siege, under blockade for about 16 years, since 2007. And that was leading, obviously, to despair and hopelessness and rage within the population. You also have to understand that Israel has been an occupying power for much of its existence, since 1967. And so if you wanted to think about the larger context, you have to say the way to avoid this kind of explosion of violence, both by Hamas, which obviously its own actions can easily be defined as a war crime, a crime against humanity, potentially having a genocidal intent. In order to avoid this kind of violence from both sides, one has to change the actual political paradigm from which it emanated. But the policy of the Israeli government, certainly the 20 years under Netanyahu, was that the so-called conflict could be managed, meaning that rather than find a political resolution to it, one can manage it. And management of that conflict in the case of Gaza was in fact to support Hamas so that it would remain strong enough for Israel to be able to say that it had no one else to deal with. That these were people you could not negotiate with. And Israel actually facilitated the delivery of millions and millions of dollars from Qatar to Gaza, being brought in bags full of money. The second way of managing the conflict by Israel, especially in Gaza, was by so-called mowing the grass. So every once in a while, when it appeared that Hamas was getting a bit too strong, Israel would just send in jet planes and artillery and tanks and destroy a neighborhood, kill several thousand people. You have to remember, in 2014, there was an Israeli operation in which about 2,500 Gazans were killed, including 500 children. And the tactics used by the IDF then were precisely those used then in 2023, only 2023 was on a much larger scale. So that's the context, and that context has to be remembered. Now, Hamas attacked, murdered over 800 civilians, also several hundred soldiers who can't be said to have been murdered, but to have been killed in fighting. And how should have Israel responded to that? Now, I think here you have to say that obviously there had to be a response and a military response to Hamas, but that response had to be part of a larger politics as to how do we make sure that this never happens again. The Israeli government should have, I think, prioritized two things. One is the return of the hostages. You have to remember there's still hostages now in Gaza after all this time and all this destruction, which is completely unthinkable. So to prioritize the return of the hostages at any price, and then to prioritize changing the politics of the region and saying, yes, Hamas has to go. This is not an organization that we can deal with, certainly not in its current formation, but we have to offer an alternative. That is, we have to now think, how do we find a way of sharing that space between Palestinians and Jews? And this government refused to do that and still refuses to do that. Because if you want a political solution, the only political solution is one where you would share the territory. If you don't want to share the territory, the only solution you can have is either oppression or genocide or ethnic cleansing. There is no other way to square this circle. And because Netanyahu and his government are very extreme right-wing, and because their main goal is to control the whole territory and have as few Palestinians there as possible, and they're not doing that only in Gaza right now. There's a great deal of violence in the West Bank. There are tens of thousands of Palestinians there who have been displaced. Because that is their goal, then the only way that they can accomplish it is by ongoing violence. And of course, impunity, in the sense that there's no pressure on Israel to change its policy, neither from the United States, nor, for that matter, from any European country, not Germany, not France, not Britain, not Italy. Spain is the only country that has sort of made some other noises, but it's not also not putting any pressure on Israel whatsoever.
Dan Diener described the massacre of October 7th as highly symbolic in its brutality. He made the point that, militarily speaking, it was even dysfunctional if the goal would have been to kill as many people as possible. The goal, according to Dan Diener, was to send a genocidal message that was understood in Israel. In your first German interview, you said about October 7th, quote, "If you link it to the Hamas Charter of 1988, one can argue that it is a genocidal act. It would be good if it were brought before an international court," unquote. Could you elaborate that?
Yeah, sure. I already indicated that before. Let me just say that I know Dan Diener. We've known each other for a very long time. I haven't read that exactly, and I don't exactly know. I don't understand exactly from what you're saying what he precisely meant in the sense of it being a symbolic act. I'm not entirely clear. I would say how I understand it. I think we don't know exactly what Hamas had in mind, although some of the plans have been were known by Israel before. Israeli intelligence and the government actually had a lot of information. They just as happened in 1973, they didn't take them seriously. They didn't think that Hamas could do it. And then when Hamas attacked, they were not prepared, not militarily and not mentally, for what happened. And in that sense, the state and the IDF abandoned large numbers of the civilians that he was supposed to protect. And not enough people have paid the price for that. It was incompetence, military incompetence, and a sort of conception that they had that these poor buggers on the other side of the fence could not challenge the might of the IDF. What Hamas had in mind, look, the people there, much as they're fanatics, clearly are not stupid. And they did not think that they were going to destroy the state of Israel. Hamas has no tanks, has no artillery, has no ships. It has rockets, and it has fighters with light automatic weapons. And it mobilized maybe 3,000, maybe it had altogether 20 or 30,000 fighters altogether. That's not a body that can challenge the IDF. Once the IDF got its act together, it took it a while. But that's just, as I say, because of incompetence. And we saw what happened since. The IDF moved into Gaza and just destroyed it all, right? Now, the Hamas Charter, which goes back to 2008, is a very peculiar document. I wrote about it a long time ago already. So when I said that in that interview, I was thinking about something that I wrote a good 20 years ago. It is a peculiar and scary document. It's an anti-Semitic document. Parts of it seem to have been taken directly from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. No organization that has that as its founding charter is an organization that you can deal with. They have, however, changed over time. We don't know how well, but we do know that in 2017, Hamas issued a very different statement. It was part of its desire to, no, not in 2017, in 2007. It was part of its attempt to create an alliance again with the Palestinian Authority. And it wrote specifically that it would be willing temporarily, one has to say, to have a hudna, to have a kind of ceasefire, a long-term ceasefire, whereby there would be a Palestinian state next to a Jewish state. That, for Israeli policymakers, appeared rather threatening instead of welcoming, because it meant that Hamas may actually have changed its positions. And it would not be the only organization in the region to have changed its positions. So if you think now, again, about what Hamas carried out on October 7th, my interpretation of it is that there was a sense, quite realistic sense, that the Palestinian issue as such was being entirely swept under the rug. You have to remember there were maybe 5 election campaigns in Israel in the previous few years. In none of them did the Palestinian issue feature at all. No one was interested in it. In the international community, there was no interest in the Palestinian issue at all. And Israel, the United States, and Saudi Arabia were on course to finding some kind of, they were negotiating for a peace and collaboration that would open trade routes to India and would normalize Israel's position within the Middle East, since it already has peace with Egypt and Jordan, now with the other most important Arab state, Saudi Arabia, and of course the Gulf states that are interested in that. And so from the point of view of people who were locked up in this open-air jail in Gaza, it appeared, I think, and there's a fair amount of evidence of that, that if they don't act now, then they will just, no one will pay any attention to them anymore. They will just be left there in that jail. So I don't think they had any intent, and with that operation, to destroy the state of Israel. If they did, then they are even crazier than we think they are. I don't think that was their intent. Their intent, I think, was to draw attention. Now, they obviously killed so many people and often in gruesome ways, that they lost all moral standing as an organization. And in my view, they cannot be partners for any negotiations. They may come in through the back door, but I don't think in the current state of things, they can be relied on. But Israel has never actually said that if Hamas leadership leaves, it would be willing to have another alternative Palestinian leadership in Gaza, obviously connected to the Palestinian Authority. And he doesn't say that because he doesn't want it. And again, what you find is that the extremes meet. That is, that for the Israeli radical right, as Minister Smotrich said about Hamas, he said Hamas is a political asset. He said that already in 2015. The extremes meet. Hamas needs the crazy far-right radicals in Israel, and the far-right in Israel needs Hamas so as to try and implement their own policies. And the country that can do that is Israel. And Hamas is in no position, and I think they know it, at least not in the historical future, to implement their vision of an Islamic state, fundamentalist Islamic state in all of Palestine. The message that really worked, and that's why I'm asking this, the message that really worked in Israel for the Israeli Jewish population was the statement that, or the series of statements that were made after the massacre and are still being made to this day, that this was the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust, and that was something that resonated, of course, very strongly with the population of Israel, as well as in many other Jewish communities around the world. And the second, that Hamas are Nazis. That triggers everything within the Israeli population. Israeli political leaders know that. And when you say that the people who attacked you are carrying out something like the Holocaust, and when you say that they're Nazis, then no holds barred. Then you can do whatever you like. And that is actually what, for the population in Israel, justified the eradication of Gaza. So this connection with genocide, in that sense of directly evoking the Holocaust, is a license for genocide. That is, to my mind, the main problem that we're seeing. And that's partly the reason why European politicians and now American politicians, although they have other motivations, are refusing to set any limits to Israeli actions in Gaza because they're afraid of being accused of allowing another genocide of the Jews, even as the state of Israel is engaged in completely eradicating Gaza. My sense is that part of that was the fact that things got out of hand. That the Hamas did not expect to be so successful, did not expect to be able to enter so many kibbutzim and towns in the south with so little resistance, with no Air Force being involved. So my sense is that they succeeded beyond their expectations because the IDF was so incompetent. And that too, what this led to was such a sense of frustration, rage, and vengeance by the IDF that had to show now that it can still do the job because it failed so miserably on October 7th. As I've said elsewhere, if you get into your car in Tel Aviv and drive to Kibbutz Be'eri, it takes you 90 minutes. If there are often jams, of course, but if you do it in the evening, you can do it in 90 minutes. It took the IDF 8 hours to get there. So I think that Hamas, in that sense, and you can hear it on some of the sort of recordings, they're shocked. There's no one to fight them. They just take over. So I think partly, yes, they were, of course, brutalized by everything that has happened to them before. One strange case is the case of that horrible massacre of the music festival, right? I mean, they landed with these vehicles, right? Yeah. Now, but you ask yourself, why was the music festival there? And it turns out, why would you organize a musical festival right next to the Gaza Strip? Why not do it elsewhere in the desert or elsewhere in the country? Well, these musical festivals produce a huge amount of noise, right? The enormous noise pollution. And most people, if they're not participating in that, don't really like that noise. So what they did, they placed it there because it's easy to get there. There's good roads leading there. And it's not far. It's only 45 miles from Tel Aviv. But they directed all the speakers toward Gaza. Now think about Gaza that has a population of over 2 million people. The majority of them are under 18 years old. And they also want to go to a music festival, right? I mean, they're also human beings. And all this noise is directed at them, but they're on the other side of the fence. And all these young Israelis are drinking and dancing and taking this drug and that drug. And the guys on the other side mean nothing to them. They couldn't care less. They're directing the speakers to them, not to the kibbutzim, because the kibbutzim don't want all this noise, right? The older people are staying at home and want to get a good night's sleep. So it's not malicious. It's simply thinking about that population on the other side as they were called later on, as human animals. They don't care about them. They have completely dehumanized them. And people that you dehumanize in that way will act toward you in a similar way. If you treat them like animals, you're making them into animals. And so part, I think, of the brutality, the inexcusable brutality of what happened on October 7th has to be taken not to the nature of those people, but to the nature of how they were treated for so many years like animals. And they will respond in excessive, horrific ways to that treatment. And the way to stop it is not to kill them. The way to stop it is to change the circumstances that have made for that. This colonial state of things where you imprison large numbers of people in cages, treat them like animals, and then wonder why, when they break out, they want to kill you.
Do you think the anti-Semitism of the original Hamas Charter is not acknowledged enough, especially on parts of the left?
No. I really don't think that's the issue at all. Look, as I said, I mean, that charter is a really crazy document. I don't think that anti-Semitism is at all the issue here. I really don't. I think anti-Semitism is being used right now in Germany, in the United States, and in other countries as a tool to shut people up, to stop criticism of Israeli policies. It's implemented very forcefully right now by the Trump administration. It's also being implemented in Germany, and people are being accused of anti-Semitism who have been critical of Israeli policies. And some of them are Palestinians, some of them are Jews. And I find that way of thinking about what is happening in the Middle East, and that's not to say that there is no anti-Semitism. There's plenty of anti-Semitism to go around, but to claim that criticism of Israeli policies is anti-Semitic, or that Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation is anti-Semitic, is completely the wrong way to go about it, and in the long run will produce more anti-Semitism, not less.
Let's shift the point of view to another key player of this conflict, We've seen the largest student protests in the US since the Vietnam War. Omri Boehm, who we have interviewed earlier, criticized that parts of the student movement are identifying with Hamas, who they uncritically see as resistance fighters. How is your perception of the campus encampments, and what do you think of the recent deportation attempts of students with regular resident status?
So first of all, there's no protest anymore. This is history. There were protests in last spring of 24. You go from one campus to another, and I teach on an American campus. There's no protest. Why are there no protests? Because university administrations clamped down on them, arguing that they were anti-Semitic, although the vast majority of the protests were not. There were some anti-Semitic voices, and there were some irresponsible, stupid people who were speaking about Hamas as some kind of glorious organization. I should say that even in Israel, both in Gaza and even more so in the West Bank, at the beginning, after October 7th, there were people who were expressing pride to what Hamas carried out, because this was a humiliating moment for the IDF, and they had been kicked around by the IDF for decades. But they also refused to acknowledge what Hamas actually did. So there was a kind of denial of the nature of the actions, but the glorification of the very fact that there was resistance. But the vast majority of the protesters on American campuses had nothing to do with anti-Semitism, and large numbers of them were Jewish. They were celebrating last year, they were celebrating Passover at Columbia. University administrations, this is still under the Biden administration, not Trump, turned very forcefully against their own students, in large part under pressure from their own donors. The American universities are very different from German universities, and they depend a great deal on donors. And they turned viciously against their own protesters, bringing in the police. And if you bring in the NYPD or the LAPD, then you can expect a lot of violence. So that's over. And I don't think it's a good thing, because there was a great deal of intimidation of students, and that intimidation is still going on to this day, and of faculty, by the way. Now, what is happening right now with the arrest of people, the cancellation of visas, the arrest of people with green cards, and for all we know, at some point also turning against naturalized American citizens or just American citizens, for expressing views that oppose Israel's war in Gaza. That is a major crisis in the United States right now. I think there is an attempt by this administration that's very different from the previous one, to use the label of anti-Semitism as a tool for a new kind of McCarthyism in the United States. That's going against the rule of law in the United States, and we don't know where this is heading, but there's intimidation everywhere. I have graduate students who are terrified, who have nothing to do with any protest whatsoever, but have foreign visas, and they don't know what's going to happen next. And it is clear that much of the information that ICE and other authorities in the United States are using is coming to them directly from extreme right-wing Jewish Israeli organizations in the United States, such as the Canary list or whatever it's called. I'm also an honorable member of that list. So they are not even doing a lot of work. They're being fed this information by extremist organizations of extreme right-wing Jews, with a lot of Israelis involved in that, who claim to be representatives of the Jewish community, which obviously they're not. So it is a moment of real peril, I would say, and it may change the nature of American universities, you will note what has happened now with Harvard, that finally found a spine and refused to accept terms imposed on it by the administration to control the content of teaching. There's the same pressure on my university, on Brown University. Columbia folded in the face of that pressure. That is an attempt by an administration. It's got nothing to do anymore with anti-Semitism or Gaza or Zionism or anything. It's got to do with imposing your own opinions on education in the United States.
Timothy Snyder, who thinks fascism is currently evolving in the US, argued recently that Trump's fight against anti-Semitism is, if anything, fomenting anti-Semitism. How does anti-Semitism currently manifest? And would you agree with this statement?
I do agree with that statement, yes. I said before, look, I mean, you have to think about it this way. Quite a number of the people who are now very exercised about anti-Semitism have a record of anti-Semitism and a record of bigotry. These are not people who like foreigners. These are not people who like others. These are people who actually want to have a white America. They have connections with white supremacy. You have to remember that it was President Trump who said about Charlottesville that there are good people, fine people on both sides. Those were people who were marching in Charlottesville saying Jews will not, what was the slogan? Jews will not control us or something like that.
Replace us.
Replace us, sorry, exactly. Jews will not replace us, which is, of course, the great replacement theory, which was hatched up, of course, in France and then imported to the United States. So, first of all, the people who are talking about anti-Semitism couldn't care less about Jews. That's not at all what they're about. They have found a tool, and they want to use the tool. The second is, unfortunately, that, as I mentioned before, much of the pressure on universities last year, on university administrations, was coming from their own donors, from their own corporations. Now, there happen to be, in those corporations, quite a number of very wealthy Jews. And those, while they, up to that point, supported liberal education and all that, once it came to Israel, they decided that it was time to shut down speech. If you shut down speech in the name of protecting Jews, and you do that by very wealthy Jews who claim to represent the Jewish community, which they do not, then you can expect that down the line, this will boomerang and come back to bite you. Especially when the people in power now are people who hate anyone who is not like them. And they have a good record of including Jews in that category of people who are not like them.
What do you think about Trump's current plans for Gaza?
Utopia, yes, of course. I mean, what could be better? We move all the people out, we rebuild it, and then we make it into a nice resort for people of the whole world. So think, you're in Germany now, right?
Yes.
So think in 1945, the Americans could have said, look at Berlin. It's just a pile of debris. How can you rebuild it? Let's move all the Germans to Madagascar, which had been already floated as a replacement place for Jews. Move all the Berliners to Madagascar, then we'll rebuild Berlin as a beautiful city, and then it'll be a city of the world. Like people from Miami could also have villas in Schlachtensee, right? So, first of all, it's crazy, but Trump is not crazy. So it sounds crazy, but it isn't. It's the first time, I believe, in a long time at least, that an American president publicly in the White House is speaking about sanctioning a war crime. Forcible displacement of people is a war crime. under international law. So he's saying those people will have to go. They don't want to go, but they have to go. So how do they go? We make them go, right? Secondly, if you think about the logic of his statement, and you see how it was received in Israel very enthusiastically by people not necessarily who support Netanyahu, by the way, you realize that that statement is a continuation of policy, because as I said before, the policy of Israel and of the IDF after October 7th was to make Gaza uninhabitable for its population. And that has largely been accomplished. And now the president of the US says, well, it's uninhabitable, of course, courtesy of vast numbers of American bombs dropped by American jets flown by Israeli pilots. Now it's uninhabitable. The most humane thing to do is to move the population out because they can't live there anymore. So in that sense, what he said is now being implemented. What he said was that we'd have to destroy Gaza entirely and then rebuild it. And this is what the IDF is doing right now. There is a misnomer that is floating around that there's a war in Gaza. There is no war in Gaza. The war in Gaza ended months and months ago. The IDF is moving from one place to another and destroying it. The only limitation of the IDF right now is not outside pressure and not even inside pressure, domestic pressure. It's that it can't get enough reservists. It's that Israeli reservists are not coming back to serve. And they're not coming back to serve largely, it appears, not because they have an opinion about the war or about destroying Gaza or about killing Palestinians, but because they've lost their jobs, they've lost their families. They think the war now is political just to maintain Netanyahu in power, and therefore they're just not coming. And so even this morning, there was news coming that the IDF has to reconsider and to move more of its regular troops, conscripts, into Gaza because the reservists are not coming. That's the only limitation, but that's a matter of time because it has the bulldozers. It was sent large numbers of bulldozers just recently by the Trump administration to do what? All these D9s to destroy Gaza. Some of them are used now in the northern West Bank as well. So from that point of view, it's not at all a crazy statement. It's actually a license to destroy Gaza, somehow getting the population to leave. It's still unclear how, but if the gates were opened, I'm sure that many Gazans would leave because they are living under absolutely horrendous conditions. There's no supply of humanitarian aid anymore. So I suspect they would leave, but where? So there is, in fact, under the radar from this sort of crazy statement, there is a genocidal logic to it of completely ethnically cleansing the Gaza Strip.
Like you already mentioned, we are in Germany. Therefore, I want to ask you two questions in terms of Germany. Future German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has publicly stated that he wants to invite Benjamin Netanyahu despite the ICC arrest warrant. What would such an invitation mean for international law?
It's destroying international law, which is really tragic. Look, I mean, the destruction of international law, and there are many culprits. There's not just one culprit, of course, but Israeli impunity during this period now, 17, 18 months, is large part of that. Obviously, also the actions of Russia in Ukraine are a major part of that. So there was an edifice of international law that was created after 1945, much of it in response to the crimes that were carried out by German rule in Europe. And one recommendation of the Genocide Convention that we spoke about at the beginning was that there would be an international criminal court. But it was, of course, not established then. Only the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, was established then. And the International Criminal Court had to await the Rome Statute and then came into being only in 2002. And it is crucial, of course, for all states that respect international law and understand why it's in their interest to maintain it, to act according to what the ICC rules. There are some states that don't recognize the ICC, and they include Russia, not surprisingly, the US, Israel, and Sudan, which is an interesting melange of countries. But Germany does. And Germany has a history that makes it particularly important for it to respect international law. And that statement by Merz, I found extraordinary. I can understand that Germany would feel uncomfortable arresting the head of the Jewish state for obvious historical reasons. But the way to avoid it is simply not to invite it. To come up with a statement that he would be formally invited to Germany by the incoming chancellor is extraordinary. I don't even understand where that was coming from. Maybe he's playing up to his own right wing. I have no idea, but it is part of a pattern that we've seen in Germany now of being completely solicitous of Israeli policies and acting really brutally against all demonstrators, especially if they can be identified as Palestinians, in German cities, and sending in the police to clamp down on them.
Germany is actively aiding and abating genocide and should be held accountable. That is Nikagawa's accusation. Though the ICJ did not see enough evidence for preliminary measures, it did not dismiss the case totally as requested by Germany, but allowed proceedings to continue. What do you think of this accusation? Do you also agree with the assessment?
Look, I mean, I think it's obvious that Germany, as well as UK, France, Italy is actually a big suppliers of arms to Israel too, and the United States are all complicit. They are complicit in A, that they are providing arms, and B, that they are providing diplomatic cover. And as you say, Germany, in that specific case, also tried to go against the ICJ. So not only is now the incoming chancellor saying that he's going to ignore the International Criminal Court, but Germany was trying also to go against the International Court of Justice. So yes, this is part of a pattern of complicity. Interestingly, from what I saw, public opinion in Germany is elsewhere. Public opinion in Germany has changed quite dramatically over the last few years and over the last few months, so that far more people now are critical of Israeli policies than in the past. But that is not reflected in the statements by politicians. And the amount of censorship in Germany on critical voices has been, well, you interviewed Omri Böhm. Omri Böhm's speech at, where was it, Buchenwald, was cancelled under that kind of pressure. And if you read his speech, it was a completely benign speech. So it was not cancelled because of the content of his speech, I think, but because of other things that he has said critically of Israel. So that's a pattern that is very dangerous. It's not only about, I'd say that's the big irony here. Supposedly it's to protect the state of Israel from genocide. It's because of the memory of the Holocaust. It's because of Germany's Staatsräson and so forth. But in fact, what he does, it's a campaign against free speech. And free speech is not about Israel-Palestine. Free speech is free speech. You can't define control of free speech on one thing, but in another place it's fine. It's either you have it or you don't. And in Germany, there have been many, many cases of people just not being allowed to talk in Germany because of the fear that it would be interpreted as anti-Semitic to say that Israel is eradicating Gaza.
Now, to conclude, we would like to close with a couple questions on education that plays a central role in commemorating past violence and preventing its reoccurrence. The renowned Israeli psychologist Dan Bar-On worked with descendants of survivors and perpetrators of the Holocaust. Later, he also worked with Israelis and Palestinians and even co-authored a history book for schools with Sami Advan. It is called Side by Side and tries to allow students to grow up being able to hold conflicting truths. He did a lot of research on trauma legacies and concluded that the greatest risk of trauma transmission to the next generation is an untold story. Do schools play a role in either perpetuating or breaking violent transmissions of trauma?
Yes, of course they do. Schools, families, just the environment that you grew up in. Again, this takes me back to my own childhood. So, yes, of course. Look, I mean, when I was, how old was I then? 7, 8, during the Eichmann trial. The Eichmann trial was being broadcast live on Israeli radio. It wasn't really live, but every evening they played excerpts from those events, and we would sit on these porches in Tel Aviv because it was very hot and have supper, and all the radios in all the porches would be turned on, and you would hear the same. That had a huge effect on members of my generation, just exposure to that, right? So it wasn't just the schools, it's something bigger than that. I think there were attempts, and Bar-On is, of course, one very good example, to have people in Israel, Jews and Palestinians, recognize each other's tragedies, each other's traumas. They're very different in a variety of ways. And there have been attempts since. I mean, there's a well-known book you probably know by Amos Goldberg and Bashir, that came out first in Hebrew and then a slightly different version of it in English, where it's an edited volume, but in the opening chapter, they talk about using the trauma of the Nakba and the trauma of the Holocaust, in fact, as events that can bring the two groups closer together rather than as competing traumas. So the potential is there. I must say, in 2022, I interviewed scores of Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel, about 55 people, and long interviews where we talked, among other things, at great length about the families they grew up in. And many of them, these are people of my generation, right? The first generation born after the state. And you could see there was a very strange similarity in the sense that people grew up in traumatized families. However, the reality on the ground in Israel right now is the exact opposite. Schools in Israel have changed a great deal. There is no freedom of speech in Israeli schools now. I mean, teachers who have said anything critical about Israeli policies have been ousted from their positions, have been investigated by the police. And generally, the younger cohorts in Israel, high school students and university students, are much more right-wing than the older cohorts, and much more racist, much more anti-Arab. There's also much more religion in Israel than there was in my time. And I'm not talking about the religion of my grandparents. I'm talking about a sort of national Zionist religion, which tends to be also racist. So, which is not the only version, of course, and not the preferred version of what Judaism should be, but is now a reigning kind of religious ideology in large parts of Israeli society today, and has infiltrated schools, has infiltrated the Ministry of Education, has infiltrated the army, has infiltrated other security services, politics, the media. So right now, the direction is the opposite direction. And I'm not very optimistic about that at all. There are attempts, there are some schools that still try to do it, but it's very, very, very hard and swimming against a very strong current.
What would a complex curriculum look like that allows all stories to be told in Israel, in Palestine, and also in Germany?
Yeah, that's look. I mean, you can't. Okay, so in Israel right now, we would like to think that it's good to start with education, and then that will lead to a change in society and politics. But in these cases, it works the other way around. I mean, it is right now impossible to reform schools in Israel. You have to change the politics. If you change the politics, you would be able to start changing the school system. You should know that the Israeli taxpayer pays a huge amount of money to fund the education of Orthodox Jews, of Haredim, in yeshivot, where none of this is relevant at all. They're not studying humanism. They're not studying universal human rights. They're studying the Talmud. And they couldn't care less about people who don't do what they do. So all of this would have to change, but you'd have to change the politics first. In Germany, that's a very different matter. Look, I mean, I think if you make an analogy in Israel, the overemphasis on the Holocaust made for a view of any threat to Israel, including the occupation itself, any threat to the occupation, as a threat, as a genocidal threat. So over years, I mean, there was already Yehuda Elkanah was a professor of philosophy of history at Tel Aviv University. Later, also taught in Germany and Austria, in Switzerland, and in the Open University. He spoke about the deleterious effects of overemphasis on Holocaust education in Israel on young Israelis. He wrote that during the first Intifada in 1988. He published an article on that, and he himself was a Holocaust survivor. In Germany, the sort of emphasis on the Holocaust and Holocaust commemoration and the kind of entire structure of German politics of memory, which I saw being built and which I think was a really glorious achievement by German society, has had also deleterious effects. Right now in Germany, we talked already about its effects on German foreign policy, but it also has affected German domestic policy, and especially integration of people coming to Germany from other countries, who all have to take up responsibility for the Holocaust, even if they came from Syria. How do you change that? How do you create a humanistic education that does recall the Holocaust, but that does not impose sort of generational guilt, which I think is part of what you see now in the radical right, the growing far right in Germany, that Mr. Musk can come to the AfD and say, enough with that guilt, right? He's playing into a sentiment. It's a sentiment that I think is more widespread than people would like to concede in Germany. So my view is that in Germany, one has to mobilize the German past, German crimes in the past in a different way, to protect human rights wherever they are, to protect international law wherever it is, to say never again against everyone. And that then means that Germany has to come out right now in protection of its own immigrant populations and in protection of Palestinians in the case of Israel, rather than sending arms to Israel to kill Palestinians.
Thank you very much. In closing, if you had to transmit the single most important lesson you learned from studying the Holocaust and genocides to your children, grandchildren, or to us and our young listeners for that matter, what would it be?
Yeah, it's a bit hard to boil it down to one point. In the United States, usually people would say, well, it should teach you tolerance. You should tolerate other people. People are not like you, have a different skin color, different religion. But I think that's a little bit of easy way out. I think to me, the most important lesson is probably that, and that's not only a lesson of the Holocaust, but of genocide more generally, that once you start speaking about a group of people, any group of people, as being somehow outside of the circle of human solidarity, once you start speaking of people as animals, as cockroaches, as vermin, Ungeziefer, whatever you call them, once you do that, you are already beginning to create not only a discourse that could end up with removal, violence, genocide, but also that begins to erode, destroy from within the very foundations of a democratic, liberal, open society, whose whole essence is that it's based on recognizing the shared humanity of us all. Whoever we are, whatever we believe in, whatever we look like, however old we are. So to me, the main lesson is that, and if you historically look at it, you can see how deep, and Hannah Arendt wrote about that, I don't need to elaborate this, that the deep roots of totalitarianism, what she called totalitarianism, Nazism in particular, the deep roots of that, and precisely in those regimes and in those traditions of oppression, of colonization, of differentiation, of racism, and of anti-Semitism, which is part of that complex, but also has its own distinct history. So that's my own understanding. We have to always remember that at the core of everything is a recognition of our shared humanity.
Thank you so much for your valuable insight. With that being said, our podcast comes to an end. Thank you so much, Professor Bartov, for taking the time for a podcast, and it was very nice talking to you.
Many thanks. It was an honor to host you today. All best for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If this conversation was meaningful or unsettling, if it left you with answers or more questions, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time on our Israel-Palestine podcast.